Good evening. We concluded the first episode of our notes on Marxism by noting that the profit of an item sold is the wage paid to the workers over and above what is necessary to keep them alive. And we also spoke about exchange value, which quite simply is how much an object costs before I use it, before I realize its actual value. Now, it just so happens that items created through human labor power are sold at a price which may be above or below the current exchange value. And what makes the exchange price fluctuate? And you guessed it, it's supply and demand. From this, including many economists, have concluded that supply and demand are the exclusive determinants of price. Now, it is true that supply and demand cause variations in price around an average level, but what determines the actual level? And it's not supply and demand, but rather the labor time utilized in producing the item. And here is a gross example. Let's say that your average exchange value of a car is $30,000, and that supply and demand cause the price to oscillate between $31,000 and $29,000. Now, let's say that there is no demand for the car for 10 days, during 10 days. You may expect the price to be reduced a bit more, but certainly not to be sold at $100. That being the case, that the exchange value of an item depends on labor power. Labor power also, that means wages, are also influenced by supply and demand, plus other factors, for example, skill level. And this difference in skill level is also reflected in the eventual exchange value of the final product. A passenger aircraft costs more than a glider because the amount of labor power involved is dramatically greater. What can we derive from this analysis of the source of profit? It explains objectively rather than ideologically why capitalism and class struggle are inextricably related. And why? Because in each enterprise, the wages paid to the workers are not the equivalent of the full value of what they produce, but only equal a fraction of it. The rest is taken by the employer. Consequently, the employer tries to increase what he takes from the worker, and he can do this in various ways. Of course, by reducing the wages, which incidentally was what happened with the recent negotiations among the US car manufacturers, or by making the workers work faster or for longer hours. And when certain limits are reached and cannot be exceeded, the next step is to move manufacturing overseas. Therefore, for example, let's say that a smartphone parts cost $50 and the wage paid to workers to assemble it is $2. Let's assume that the exchange value of the smartphone is $300. The worker will have contributed $300 less $50, that is $250. But he will have received only $2 out of the $250, which explains, by generalizing the phenomenon, why so many areas of the Rust Belt of the traditional manufacturing centers in the US look like this, and which also explains what cannot be denied, irrespective of the remarkable acrobatics that sundry politicians of any color perform to hide the truth that some may deem unpleasant. The class struggle is inherent in the capitalistic mode of production. That is, there are two antagonistic interests clashing in the process of production. We now briefly examine what is capital, which takes many physical forms: machinery, buildings, materials, everything needed for production, including, of course, the wages for the employees. However, not all property is capital. Imagine a hermit who owns a house, a yard, maybe a cow, and some money. He is self-sufficient, but none of his property is capital, which leads to an important point. Property becomes economic capital only when it is used to produce surplus value, meaning that when it is used to employ workers who, by producing things, produce surplus value. And here is an interesting, I think, historical consideration. The early accumulation of capital was through robbery, typically, for example, the wholesale robberies and slaughters conducted by European explorers in America to export Christianity. Other forms of capital accumulations are less obvious but not less profound. One of the effects of the English Civil War that we spoke about before was the so-called Enclosure Act, that is, the theft of common land for the benefit of capitalist farmers. By the way, in England, many parts still retain the denomination of commons, a historical reference to a time when people made a living, or at least survived, by cultivating the commons. By the Enclosure Act, the peasants were turned automatically into proletarians who worked for a new owner, land which they previously owned or at least cultivated for themselves. Alternatively, they moved to the cities to find some other capitalist employer. And Marx calls this primitive accumulation. And he makes this interesting observation. The primitive accumulation plays in political economy the same part as original sin in theology. In times long gone, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals spending their substance and more in riotous living. Thus it came to pass that the former sort of accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell, except their own skin. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority that, despite all its labors, has up to now nothing to sell by itself. And those who have read Max Weber's interesting book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, may recall that Weber derives all sorts of deductions and conclusions from the same core theme. Another method of capital accumulation, Marx says, is indirect robbery. Warning again, please set aside any ideological implications. I'm only using Marx's word. The capitalists, by appropriating the surplus value delivered by the workers, can further increase the total surplus value, which becomes capital, with which the capitalist can employ more workers, and so on to his heart's content. But it never exactly runs this way due to a number of inconveniences and obstacles that present themselves in the path of the capitalist, typically crisis. Why do crises occur? Asks Marx. It is a law of capitalistic production whereby capital strives to expand, to make more profit, and to sell more products. The more capital, the more production. The more production, the less labor power employed due to the rationalization of industry. That is, more capital means more production and less wages, therefore less demand for the products made. In conclusion, the disproportion between the expansions of the capital and the reduction of workers' demand and the reduction of wages is a natural and ultimate reason and cost for crisis. However, there are circumstances which distort or somewhat alter the picture. For example, if government decides to invest heavily in the military, that procurement is generally outside of the normal capitalistic process. Another distorting factor is the government buying agricultural surplus of products or a large expansion of consumer credit. Another important component of the capitalistic landscape is, of course, competition. And this has two contradictory results. A company, in order to sell more, tries to reduce costs through reduction of wages or, if you like, automation. On the other hand, enterprises successful at reducing wages and costs contribute to the reduction of demand due to the reduced overall wages paid. Nevertheless, a company that improves its techniques and makes greater profit will cause its competitors either to do the same or go out of business. And the consequence is that in any branch of industry or commerce, the number of competitors is steadily reduced. Big companies and conglomerates appear. Today we call them multinational, but they are really monopolies. Therefore, the paradoxical result of competition is that competition creates its opposite, capitalist monopoly. But it does not end here, and at first sight it is difficult to conceive that capitalist monopoly is the material father of modern imperialism and of modern wars. When we think of imperialism, we associate it with the desire to conquer less developed countries to form an empire. As the word says, imperialism implies a desire to make an empire. Other reasons that disguise the real cause and nature of imperialism are, for example, the need for new markets or for raw materials or for land to accommodate excess population and so forth. But let's think about it. Foreign countries can indeed be very good markets, and they can supply food and raw materials in exchange. Take the case of Iraq, just to make an example, recent. The Iraqis could not possibly use or drink all the oil they produce, and Saddam Hussein was more than willing to sell it at the price established by the so-called oil cartel, which, by the way, is also a monopoly. Why then the need of war rather than trade? It is counterintuitive and it defeats logic. Equally counterintuitive is the conscription of millions of people into the military and sending them to die because capital has reached the limit of expansions inside its own country and must imperialistically expand abroad. And that to secure this expansion, the only way possible is war, invasion, and slaughter. Therefore, to demonstrate why military imperialism is a special stage of capitalism, we must dig a little bit deeper into the issue and follow the development historically. At the onset of industrial capitalism, enterprises were small, needing relatively small capital to start and get going. Every new technical development made more capital necessary to invest in machinery. And independently of the industry involved, a large enterprise was more economical to run and expanded more quickly and, of course, made more profit. Smaller companies closed down or were absorbed into larger enterprises. And the proportion of production controlled by very few, very rich people grew very quickly. The inevitable end result was and would be the replacement of competition, of free competition, as I said, by monopolies. And monopolies involved the concentration both of production and of capital. In every industry, a large percentage of trade is conducted by very few concerns, linked together by agreements for price fixing, quotas, and so forth. And this has been and is happening under our own eyes, except that we do not notice it. Just consider the economic abyss between the little stores independently owned versus the mega franchises, which are but monopolies under another name. But returning to the historical thread, inherent to the creation of monopolies has been the merging of banking and industrial capital, with the creation of what is called the finance capital oligarchy that virtually ruled and still rules just about each country. As a consequence, the richest capitalists, whether they started as bankers or capitalists, became banker capitalists. And evidence is, for example, that many big bankers are directors of big industries and many big industrialists are directors of owners of big banks. The merging of capital, banking, and industrial capital into finance capital dramatically increased the influence of this on the state. And now we come to the conceptual switch that transforms capitalism into imperialism. For now, with the forming of the finance capital oligarchy, a new export branch was born, distinguished from the export of commodities, namely the export of capital. Initially, export of capital was done on conditions that material, technology, and whatever else of the capital importing country needed would have to be purchased from the country that exported the capital. Therefore, the two wings of finance capital work together. International monopoly combines of finance capitalists were formed and divided the world among them. And this, roughly speaking, corresponds to the first generation colonial system. There were some squabbles about which country would occupy which colony, but by and large, the colonization of the colonizable world occurred within excessive bloodshed among the colonizers. And in this respect, note that there passed about 100 years between Waterloo and World War I, with relatively international peace. But all things come to an end, and so did the number of defenseless countries to be colonized. Now, the finance capital groups could expand their capital exports only at each other's expense, that is, only by large-scale wars to resize and redivide the world in favor of the winners. Bottom line, the imperialist stage of capitalism is inevitably associated both with economic crises and wars on a world scale. Have you ever asked yourself why, jumping a little ahead in this demonstration, have you ever asked yourself why, with the end of civilization's enemy number one, communism, the US keeps and maintains almost 1,000 military bases worldwide? Think about it. To return to finance capital, as the concentration of finance capital grew, so the policies of the various countries' governments became more closely associated with the interests of the very well-defined and identified concentrated finance capital. Now, finance capital sounds so abstract as to appear almost a theoretical construction. But we must not forget that there would not be concentrated finance capital if it were not concentrated into a few people. And I do not like to call it an elite, because elite suggests excellence in the Greek philosophical sense. Let's call it a cabal. This enormously influential cabal, until recently, fought other countries with tariffs, quotas, and wars. Most recently, the cabal is even more influential than the actual sovereign states. And this is why the expansion of imperialistic capitalism has taken two directions. On the one hand, the traditional route, with the difference that a world war is the last resort, hopefully. It is more expedient and efficient to concentrate on limited wars and fomenting color revolutions by removing governments that dare to disagree with finance capital. A classic example recent is Ukraine. You may remember that, quite plainly, Victoria Nuland, American-Ukrainian boss, declared plainly that the US spent $5 billion to have a regime change in Ukraine. That seems a lot, $5 billion, but it's actually peanuts. It is true that the Ukrainian populace is at the edge of actual starvation, but the media doesn't talk about it, but it is so. But finance capital couldn't be happier, as all the assets of the country are privatized, which is a euphemism meaning that they are sold very cheaply to foreign private financial capital monopolies. But some of you may ask, why not just agree to divide the world among the large finance capitalists? It would seem, and actually it makes sense, and such agreements occur from time to time. The problem, however, or rather the reality, is that such international agreements are never lasting. But, you may say, what about the global trade agreements such as NAFTA or the most recent infamous TTIP? NAFTA is now 30 years old and is still in force. True, but NAFTA and other mega agreements of this type are part of a new structure of finance capital which fits perfectly the so-called New World Order. In the New World Order, we have no longer competing finance capital organizations fighting each other on a nationalistic scale. These agreements are articulated in ponderous and lengthy tomes with thousands of articles, and they actually constitute the final enchainment, unfortunately, of common people of different cultures and of different nations to enchainment to one and one only world order, where everyone is slave to the supreme god of finance capital. Again, examples are too many even to try to list them. As we are producing this episode, we have the classic, horrible, murderous, but clear case of finance capital domination, just quote a country in Honduras, with the murder of Berta Cáceres and other prominent representatives of the Aboriginal population opposed to a mega dam that would destroy their land and environment. The media has given little account of the matter because finance capital domination also implies the domination of the mass media, which, that is, mass media domination can be easily accomplished democratically simply because, as the Supreme Court has recently decreed, money is free speech, that is, freedom of speech is proportional to the money you have. Therefore, following this line of reasoning, the more money you have, the freer you are to speak, until, paradoxically, finance capital will have infinite freedom of speech because only finance capital will have the power to be heard. The latest development, meaning the establishment of the New World Order, is very recent. Earlier on, as I said, there were agreements among finance capital establishments, but they were temporary, because unequal development is a law of the growth of capital. At this point, the group or the country that has developed more strongly or faster is no longer content with its former allocation, that is, with the already reached agreements. From this point of view, that is, from the historical economical point of view, economic agreements are a kind of armistice in a continuous trade war between finance capital groups of different countries. 2 world wars have been the outcome of the concentration of wealth in the hands of finance capital groups in each country. That is, what on the surface seems a completely economic process, meaning the concentration of production and capital, leads inevitably to war. The 2 world wars were due, we could say, only and exclusively to the conflicting interests of different finance capital groups. Though, even then, there were already the symptoms of what in time would become the New World Order. It is well known that some multinational conglomerates were supplying both the American and the German war machine in World War II. But, someone may object, how can you set aside the issues of nationalism, the love of king and country, the hatred of the enemy, and similar other arguments? The answer is that I do not. But if you can fool 800 million people, which is roughly the combined population of the US and Europe, into believing that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, just imagine how easy it is to conceal the objective of finance capital under an astonishing wide array of lies, obfuscation, treacheries, and betrayals. All this is going finally to prove that imperialism is the last stage of finance capitalism. One more point on why it is extremely profitable to have traditional colonies, and now that the term colony is not as popular as before, to have economic colonies. Let's take again the example of a smartphone. It is true that manufacturing has been shifted to places where manpower is cheapest, but for practical purposes, let's take a smartphone as a representative of a typical US product. And let's say that a smartphone in the US costs $300, that is, it has an exchange value of $300. But the same $300 in a third world country subjected to financial colonialism buys much more than the same $300 would buy in the United States. That is, the same smartphone is exchanged, say in Vietnam, at 10 times its value in the US. That exchange could be converted typically in raw materials or specialized good, which in this transaction become much cheaper due to the colonized nature of the country where they are made or extracted from. At the consumer level, let's say that it takes 1 week of labor to accumulate enough reserve to buy one smartphone in the US. In a financially colonized country, it would take 1 year. And now you can understand or explain better why some youngsters in some third world countries are prepared to sell their kidneys to own a smartphone. The bottom line is that these enormous extra profits realizable in financially colonized countries convert into enormous fortunes realized by the finance capital groups. Which is why, as soon as a colonized country attempts to shake off the shackles keeping it enchained to the banking system managed and directed by the finance capital conglomerates, the same conglomerates call in the military to ensure obedience. It may sound strange expressed in this fashion, but you have under your internet eyes the appalling pictures of Iraq, Libya, Syria, with entire cities gutted and literally leveled to the ground, where only a few years before they were relatively, at that time, actually prosperous. If you keep in mind the correlation between finance capitalism and imperialism, everything makes sense, including war. For war is actually doubly profitable. In the first place, it destroys potential challenges to finance capital monopolies. And secondly, disaster capitalism, and you may have heard the term already, is a double bonanza with bewildering profits. Why? Because finance capitalism thrives on destruction because it supplies the arms necessary to destroy, and secondly, the tools necessary to rebuild. The exploitation of the third world has implication for the domestic labor world as well. Until recently, the capitalist class domestically was able to respond to the pressure of the working class by providing better conditions for the upper echelons of workers in certain specific industries. Therefore, the skilled working class tended to identify their interests with the capitalist exploitation of the third world. But now, as you know, the working class has lost much of its former bite, or rather, with the genial sleight of hands, the big unions, or what remains of them, identify themselves with the capitalist echelon, if you have followed the recent developments. To summarize, the first capital evolution occurred when the serfs left the manorial estate for the towns, establishing an artisan and a merchant class. The wars of the late Middle Ages eliminated feudalism that was replaced by the central state, which to an extent held the capitalist class, now called the bourgeoisie at bay. The Civil War in England and the French Revolution 100 years later sanctioned the leadership of the capitalist bourgeoisie and the effective end of the nobility as a class. Capitalism exploded during the Industrial Revolution, leading to the creation of monopolies, the monopolies now being tied closely with finance capitalism. Finance capitalism finds the more profitable opportunities in the exploitation of third world countries and generally in war. Next time, we will examine the class struggle, which, as we said at the beginning, is a feature of any capitalist society. We will examine the class struggle with respect to the state. Until then, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Thank you for watching. Good night.